The rain pounded the roof in rhythmic beats as Jamie drove along the empty, winding road leading to his hometown. It was a last-minute decision to visit his old friends, as if something had been calling him back, tugging at his mind. The familiar, eerie landscape of dense trees flanking both sides of the road felt closer than usual, and the faint outline of the moon was barely visible behind thick clouds. There was an unsettling feeling in the air, like the entire town was holding its breath. As Jamie approached the town limits, he noticed something odd. The streetlights, one after another, flickered as he passed, casting brief glimpses of shadowed houses and dense woods. Each flicker seemed to reveal something darker in the surrounding area, shapes that disappeared the instant the light returned. Shaking off the feeling, Jamie laughed it off. His old friends had always told him that the place was haunted, that strange figures and eerie shadows were commonplace here, especially on foggy nights like this. Finally, reaching his old friend Chris's house, Jamie was greeted by a warm but subdued gathering of friends he hadn't seen in years. They swapped stories and laughed about old memories, each glass of wine loosening up tales from the past. Eventually, the conversation drifted to strange, unexplainable experiences, rumors, ghost stories, and unsettling memories everyone had of the area. Everyone had a story or two, but then Chris leaned in, his voice low. "You guys ever hear about the man in the dark?" The group fell silent, leaning closer to hear more. Jamie shivered. He had heard that name before, maybe whispered by kids in the neighborhood, but he never thought much of it until now. "People say he's been around here for years, maybe decades," Chris continued, his voice almost a whisper. "No one knows who he is. He shows up in strange places, empty fields, backyards, woods. Sometimes he just stands there, staring. You don't see his face, just his silhouette. Tall, dark, impossible to make out any features. And the worst part? They say that if he looks at you, you'll feel it deep down like he's watching you forever." Laughter erupted from the group, more nervous than genuine, and they tried to brush it off as just another ghost story. But Jamie couldn't shake the chill that settled in his bones. He brushed it off, though, not wanting to seem like he was rattled. The night wore on, and everyone finally called it quits, heading home one by one. Jamie stayed at Chris's place, opting to sleep on the couch. Sometime past midnight, he woke to a strange sound, like someone whispering his name. Blinking his eyes open, he glanced at the clock. It was 3:07 a.m. He strained his ears, listening. Silence. The kind of silence that feels too thick, too unnatural. Deciding it was nothing, he lay back down, but then came the noise again. Jamie. It was soft, barely audible, as if it were drifting through the walls. He sat up, his heart pounding, and peered through the window. His breath caught. There, at the edge of the yard, was a shadow, a tall, slender figure standing perfectly still in the darkness. Jamie's heart hammered in his chest, his mind racing with disbelief. He squinted, trying to make out a face, but there was only darkness and emptiness where a person's face should have been. Frozen, Jamie didn't dare move. The figure didn't move either, only standing there, somehow sensing Jamie's gaze as if waiting. Jamie's mouth went dry as he tried to look away, but he couldn't. He was transfixed, his gaze locked onto the dark figure until he felt his own will slipping away. Just then, a hand grabbed his shoulder, making him jump. He whipped around to see Chris standing there, his face pale. "You saw him, didn't you?" he whispered. Jamie nodded, swallowing hard. "Who? What?" Chris looked away, his jaw clenched. He's always there, Jamie. The man in the dark. Once you see him, it doesn't stop. Every time you look into the dark, he's there, waiting. I don't know what he wants, but it doesn't end." That night, Jamie barely slept. He left the next morning. The image of the dark figure burned into his mind. He tried to brush it off as just a nightmare, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was still being watched. Even back home, he began to notice shadows lingering in corners, faint outlines just beyond his line of sight. Every night, he felt the man in the dark was there, waiting in the depths, watching him. One evening, the terror reached a peak. Jamie sat in his room, paralyzed by the sensation of a presence watching him from the window. The curtains were drawn, but he could feel it. With a shaking hand, he reached for the curtain, hesitated, then threw it open. The yard was empty. He let out a sigh of relief, feeling foolish. But then a slight movement caught his eye, a shape emerging from the tree line. Tall, dark, and unmoving, the figure stood there in the shadows, only yards away from his window. The man in the dark. And this time, Jamie knew he wasn't going away. He closed the curtains, heart racing, but the feeling of those empty eyes never left him. Days passed, and Jamie felt himself spiraling into paranoia. Shadows seemed to creep closer. Every darkened room felt like a trap. He tried to explain it to friends, but they only looked at him with pity and disbelief. They told him he was imagining things, that he needed rest, maybe even therapy. But Jamie knew the truth. He knew that somewhere in the darkness, the man in the dark was there, always watching, always waiting. The house at the end of Willow Lane had been abandoned for years. Its boarded-up windows, rotting porch, and overgrown yard gave it an unmistakable air of decay. Local kids dared each other to go near it, but none were brave enough to stay more than a few minutes. The stories about the house were endless, whispers of shadows moving behind the windows, strange sounds at night, and, most chillingly, a face that sometimes appeared in the upstairs window, just a glimpse before disappearing. Maya had heard all the stories, but she wasn't scared. She was the logical type, a skeptic, the kind of person who found horror movies predictable and laughed at ghost stories. So when her friends dared her to spend just one night in the house, she accepted without a second thought. They gathered outside the rusted iron gate just before sunset, snickering and exchanging nervous glances as Maya approached with her backpack and a flashlight. "Good luck, Maya," her friend Leah said, half jokingly. "Hope you don't meet him in there." "Who?" Maya asked with a raised eyebrow. Leah shrugged. "They say a man used to live here alone. He disappeared one night, and no one ever saw him again. People think his spirit still wanders the house." Maya laughed, waving off the comment as she pushed open the front door, which creaked loudly. Her friends watched as she stepped inside, then disappeared from view when the door swung shut behind her. The house was dark, its air thick with dust and an odd, stale smell. Maya shined her flashlight around the empty living room. The floors creaked with every step and the walls were peeling, revealing layers of wallpaper from decades past. She made her way upstairs, deciding she'd sleep in one of the old bedrooms. It felt safer up there somehow, away from the broken windows and the creepy, echoing silence of the first floor. Settling into a dusty corner of the smallest bedroom, Maya unrolled her sleeping bag and checked her phone. No service, of course. She sighed and decided to read a bit to pass the time. Hours passed, and the house remained quiet. It was almost too quiet, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Around midnight, just as she started to doze off, she heard something. A soft, shuffling sound, like footsteps, coming from the hallway just outside her door. She froze, holding her breath, listening intently. But the sound stopped, leaving her alone in silence again. She tried to shake off her unease, convincing herself it was just an animal or the house settling. But deep down, she felt an unnatural presence, as if something were watching her. Then it happened again. Soft, deliberate footsteps, inching closer to her door. This time, they didn't stop. They came closer, louder, until they were just outside her room. Maya's heart pounded as she stared at the door, half expecting it to burst open. But instead, the footsteps moved away, down the hall, and disappeared down the stairs. She exhaled shakily, gripping her flashlight and deciding to investigate. She would prove to herself that it was just her imagination. With the flashlight in hand, she crept out of the room and into the dark hallway. She reached the top of the stairs and shined the light down, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" Nothing. Just as she turned to go back to her room, she heard a low, raspy whisper. "Maya." Her blood ran cold. The voice had come from right behind her, as if someone were standing inches away. She whipped around, her flashlight illuminating the empty hallway. Trembling, she called out again, trying to steady her voice. "Who's there?" Silence. Then in the corner of her eye, she saw it. A dark, shadowy figure standing at the other end of the hall, just beyond her flashlight's reach. Tall, with shoulders hunched and a face obscured by darkness, it stood motionless, as if waiting. Maya backed away slowly, her heart racing as she kept the beam of light pointed in its direction. But as soon as she looked away for a split second, the figure was gone. She turned and fled to the stairs, desperate to leave the house. But halfway down, she stopped. There, at the bottom, was the figure, waiting silently. "No, this isn't real," she whispered to herself, gripping the railing so tightly her knuckles turned white. But as she stared at it, the figure began to shift, moving toward her one slow, deliberate step at a time. She turned and raced back upstairs, her mind racing as she tried to think of an escape. Her only option was the window in the bedroom, the one her friends had said was haunted by the man's face. She locked herself in the room and threw the window open, looking out at the drop below. It was too far to jump, but she was trapped. She turned to look at the door, and that's when she heard it again. "Maya!" The whisper was inside the room now, right next to her ear. She could feel a cold breath on the back of her neck. Slowly, she turned, her heart thudding so hard it felt like it would burst. The figure was there, inches away, its face finally visible in the moonlight. A pale, twisted visage, its eyes hollow and empty, its mouth stretching into an unnatural smile. Maya's scream caught in her throat as the figure raised a bony finger to its lips, as if to shush her. The last thing she remembered was the icy touch of its hand on her shoulder, pulling her down into darkness. Her friends found her the next morning, her flashlight and belongings scattered in the empty house. She was sitting in the corner of the upstairs room, staring blankly, her eyes wide and haunted. No matter how hard they tried, she wouldn't speak. She wouldn't even blink. All she would do was sit there, a hollow, empty look in her eyes, the same look the man in the dark was rumored to have. To this day, they say Maya is still in there, silent and unblinking, a warning to anyone who dares to step into the house at the end of Willow Lane. Sarah and her husband Tom were thrilled to finally purchase their dream home. It was a sprawling old farmhouse on a large, isolated plot of land, the nearest neighbor miles away. It needed some work, but that only added to the charm. The day they moved in, the previous owner, a frail, elderly man, had only one piece of advice as he handed Tom the keys. "Just stay out of the basement," he muttered before limping off without another word. Sarah and Tom laughed it off. They were modern, practical people, not the types to worry about haunted basements. Besides, the basement would be perfect for storage. But when they tried to open the basement door, they found it locked tight. Tom even tried to pry it open with a crowbar, but stopped when the door didn't budge. They decided to deal with it later, feeling slightly irked at the mystery of it. Over the next few weeks, strange things began to happen in the house. Sarah would hear faint whispers when she was alone in the kitchen, and Tom swore he'd seen movement out of the corner of his eye. Doors they'd left open would be closed, and items seemed to vanish, only to reappear in different rooms. They both felt watched, especially near the basement door. One night, Tom woke up to a strange sound, a dull, rhythmic thudding coming from downstairs. He looked at the clock, 3:03 a.m. He lay still, hoping it would stop, but the thudding only grew louder, more insistent, like something was banging from beneath the floor. It was coming from the basement. He shook Sarah awake, and together they crept downstairs. As they approached the basement door, the banging stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. "It's probably just pipes or something," Sarah whispered, but she didn't sound convinced. They went back to bed, their nerves on edge. The next day, Tom called a locksmith. "The door's stuck," he explained. "We need to get in there." The locksmith arrived, took one look at the basement door, and frowned. "This is an old lock. Very old. Haven't seen one like this in years." After a few minutes of fiddling, the lock finally clicked open. The locksmith looked uneasy as he handed Tom the key. "Be careful," he murmured, glancing at the basement door with a strange look in his eye before leaving. That evening, Tom and Sarah decided to finally see what was behind the door. Armed with a flashlight, they descended into the basement. The air grew colder with each step, thick and stale as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing an empty, dusty room with stone walls and a dirt floor. It looked entirely ordinary, except for one thing. In the middle of the room was a large wooden chest. It was ancient, covered in dust, and bound with thick iron chains. The wood looked splintered and worn, as if it had been clawed at. Carved into the wood were faint words that were barely legible, letters that looked scratched in by fingernails. Sarah leaned in, squinting in the dim light. "Do not open." Tom took a step back, shaking his head. "It's just an old chest, probably left by the previous owners." But the warning had a strange effect on Sarah. She couldn't pull her eyes away from it, a gnawing curiosity growing inside her. She felt drawn to the chest, an almost uncontrollable urge to open it and see what lay inside. That night, Sarah dreamt of the chest. She dreamt of a dark figure crouched next to it, whispering her name over and over. Its voice was soft, gentle, coaxing her closer. She woke up drenched in sweat, her heart racing. She glanced over at Tom, who was fast asleep, and tried to shake off the feeling, but the whispering still lingered in her mind, like an echo. The next night, the thudding returned, louder than ever. It reverberated through the floor, as if something were slamming itself against the walls of the basement. Sarah sat up, holding her breath, and felt a tug, deep and unexplainable. She got out of bed, moving almost in a trance, and headed for the basement. Tom woke up to find her standing in front of the basement door, her hand on the knob. "Sarah, what are you doing?" he whispered, his voice filled with alarm. She didn't answer, only stared at him, her eyes unfocused. After a few seconds, she seemed to come to her senses and pulled her hand away, shivering. But the pull grew stronger over the next few nights. Sarah became obsessed with the chest, convinced that something important, something life-changing lay inside. She argued with Tom, insisting that they open it, while he pleaded with her to let it go. But she wouldn't listen. The voice had started to whisper to her even when she was awake, calling her, guiding her down to the basement night after night. One evening, Tom came home to find the basement door wide open. His heart sank as he rushed downstairs. There was Sarah, kneeling in front of the chest, her eyes wild and hollow. She had removed the chains, her hands bloody from clawing at the rusty locks. She looked up at him, a strange smile twisting her lips. "It wants us to open it, Tom. It needs us to set it free," she whispered, her voice barely her own. "No, Sarah, don't," he shouted, lunging toward her. But it was too late. With a final twist, she opened the chest. For a moment, there was nothing, just an empty, gaping darkness inside. But then, a foul stench filled the room and the lights flickered. Tom staggered back, choking on the air as an overwhelming sense of dread washed over him. From the chest, a shadow began to rise. It was blacker than anything he had ever seen, like the absence of light itself. The figure was tall, thin, and had elongated limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally, filling the room. It had no face, just a smooth, featureless void where eyes and a mouth should have been. The shadow stretched towards Sarah, wrapping around her like smoke. She stood motionless, her face blank, as if in a trance. The darkness seeped into her eyes, her mouth and her nose, filling her with an unearthly blackness. She shuddered, her body convulsing as if something were crawling inside her. Tom screamed, grabbing her arm and trying to pull her away, but it was like she was anchored to the spot. She turned to him slowly, her eyes now pools of empty darkness. "Tom," she whispered, her voice layered with a deep, guttural tone. "It's too late. You shouldn't have opened the door." Before he could react, she lunged at him, her hands cold as ice as they wrapped around his throat. Her grip was impossibly strong, and he struggled, gasping for air, as he felt the darkness spreading from her hands into his skin, seeping into his bones. Tom's vision faded as he lost consciousness, his last thought a plea for help, for salvation from the darkness he had unleashed. When he awoke, he was alone in the basement. The chest was closed, the chains lying broken on the floor. There was no sign of Sarah. He stumbled upstairs, calling her name, but there was only silence. Days passed, then weeks. The police searched, but there was no trace of her. Tom never told anyone what had happened in the basement, and he never returned to it. But every night he hears the whispering, the voice of his wife, calling him from below, begging him to come back down to join her in the dark. It was supposed to be a relaxing camping trip. 3 friends, Jake, Emily, and Nick, had planned the trip for weeks, eager to escape their jobs and the noise of the city. They chose a remote spot deep in the forest, miles away from the nearest town. The air was fresh, the stars were bright, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the crackle of their campfire. The first 2 nights were perfect. They spent their days hiking and exploring, their evenings around the fire, sharing stories and laughing. But on the 3rd night, things changed. It started just after midnight. Jake woke up to the sound of twigs snapping outside the tent, close enough to make the hair on his neck stand up. He glanced over at Emily and Nick, who were fast asleep, and decided not to wake them. He figured it was probably a deer, or maybe a raccoon foraging nearby. But the sounds didn't stop. The snapping grew louder, followed by a faint rustling that seemed to circle the tent. Jake lay still, listening, his heart pounding. He thought about unzipping the tent to look outside, but couldn't shake the sudden, overwhelming feeling that he was being watched. Just then, Emily woke up, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, clutching her sleeping bag. "Yeah," Jake replied. "I think it's just an animal." But Emily shook her head. "It doesn't sound like any animal I've heard." Nick stirred, rubbing his eyes, and mumbled, "What's going on?" "Something's out there," Emily said, her voice trembling. Nick, trying to play the hero, unzipped the tent and peered outside with his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, the shadows dancing in the wavering light. "Nothing here, guys," he said, shrugging. "Probably just the wind." They tried to laugh it off, but an uneasy feeling settled over them as they lay back down. The forest was too quiet. The usual nighttime sounds, crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, had all but vanished. Eventually, they drifted back to sleep. But Jake woke up again just a couple of hours later, this time to a different sound. A strange, hollow whistling coming from somewhere nearby. It was soft, almost melodic, like someone whistling an old tune. But the tune was haunting, the kind of melody that twisted into your mind and stayed there, tugging at your nerves. "Do you guys hear that?" Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. Emily and Nick were already awake, sitting up and listening. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with fear. The whistling grew louder, shifting direction as if circling their camp. "Who's out there?" Nick called, his voice breaking. "We're just camping here. We're not bothering anyone." The whistling stopped abruptly, leaving a thick silence in its place. They held their breath, listening. The silence stretched on, almost suffocating, until suddenly there was a laugh. A low, guttural sound that chilled them to the core. It sounded close, impossibly close, as if someone were standing just outside the thin wall of the tent. They scrambled to get dressed, abandoning their sleeping bags, desperate to leave. But as they tried to pack up their things, they heard footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps crunching through the leaves. The footsteps grew louder, drawing closer and closer, until they stopped right outside the tent. None of them dared to move. They barely breathed. The faint light from the fire cast a shadow on the tent wall. Tall, thin, with limbs that seemed too long and too thin to belong to any normal person. The shadow shifted, leaning toward the tent as if trying to peer inside. And then the voice came again, whispering, "Come out! Come out!" Emily stifled a scream, her hand clasped over her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. Jake's hands shook as he reached for his flashlight, hoping to scare away whatever was lurking outside. But just as he clicked it on, the shadow vanished. The footsteps retreated, fading into the distance until there was nothing but silence. They bolted out of the tent, clutching their flashlights and bags, not caring about leaving behind most of their gear. They sprinted through the forest, their flashlight beams bouncing wildly as they stumbled over roots and rocks. The night was pitch black, the trees looming over them like silent, sinister giants. After what felt like an eternity, they reached their car and piled inside, locking the doors and trying to catch their breath. They sat in silence, each of them too afraid to speak. But as Jake fumbled for his keys, he noticed something. A small note pinned under the windshield wiper. He hesitated, then reached out and grabbed it, his hand shaking. He unfolded the note, and his heart dropped. The note read in scratchy, uneven handwriting, "You can't run from the forest." Before they could react, a faint, familiar whistling started up again, somewhere just beyond the tree line. The tune was the same haunting melody they'd heard before, only this time it was louder, closer. They looked at each other, terror in their eyes, and without another word, Jake started the car, and they sped away, leaving the campsite and their camping gear behind. They never spoke of that night again. They didn't dare. But sometimes late at night when they were alone, each of them would hear it, that same whistling tune, drifting in from the dark edges of their rooms, fading in and out as if reminding them. No matter how far they went, they would never truly leave the forest behind. Max was a night guard at an old museum, a job he took for the quiet hours and easy pay. The building was ancient, filled with artifacts from around the world. Some were beautiful, others eerie, but they were all just objects to him. Until the night he started to notice things he couldn't explain. It began subtly. One night, as he walked his usual patrol, he noticed one of the exhibits. A tall, worn statue of a woman draped in stone robes seemed to be facing a different direction. He brushed it off as his mind playing tricks, convincing himself it had always looked that way. But then he noticed it again the following night, and the night after that. Each time he passed by, it seemed to be angled slightly more toward him. Its blank stone eyes stared into the empty hallway, and the feeling it gave him was unsettling, as though it could see him, as though it were waiting. One evening, he brought it up with his colleague, Ray, who worked the earlier shift. "Hey, Ray, you ever get a weird feeling about the statue in Gallery B?" Ray's face went pale. "Oh, you mean her? Yeah, I try not to look at it much. There's something wrong about it." Ray explained that the statue was over 1,000 years old, dug up from an unmarked tomb in a foreign country. The archaeologists who found it had all reportedly fallen ill after the discovery, and a few of them had even passed away under strange circumstances. Max laughed it off nervously, but Ray's serious look lingered in his mind as he resumed his shift. He avoided the statue that night, making a point to stay clear of Gallery B entirely. But just as he was about to clock out around 3 a.m., a low, scraping sound echoed through the empty halls, coming from Gallery B. It was a dragging noise, as if something heavy was sliding across the stone floor. Against his better judgment, Max took out his flashlight and headed toward the sound. When he turned the corner into Gallery B, his heart skipped a beat. The statue had moved. It was no longer on its pedestal, but was instead halfway across the room, facing the doorway as if it had been waiting for him. Its stone robes had shifted, revealing long, thin fingers peeking from beneath the folds. They looked almost human. He backed up slowly, his breathing shallow, but as he turned to run, the lights in the hallway flickered and went out, plunging him into darkness. His flashlight flickered too, struggling to stay on as he stumbled backward, his pulse racing. And then he heard it, a soft, whispering sound, like someone mumbling just out of reach. He couldn't make out the words, but it was coming from behind him, near the statue. Terrified, he bolted down the hallway, feeling a cold gust brush the back of his neck as he ran. He could still hear the whispering, closer now, as though it were following him. He didn't stop until he reached the security office, slamming the door and locking it behind him. He pressed his ear to the door, listening. Silence. Shaken, he stayed in the office, breathing heavily, until his shift finally ended. As he left the museum, he glanced back, half expecting to see the statue watching him through one of the windows. The next night, he considered quitting, but he convinced himself he'd imagined it all, that he was just tired. He clocked in, steeling himself for another patrol, but things only got worse. Every time he passed through Gallery B, the statue seemed to be in a new position. One night, he found it crouched in the corner, like it was hiding. Another night, it seemed to have leaned forward, its stone face close to the ground, as if searching for something. And then one night, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Faint, dusty footprints leading from the statue's pedestal and back again. They were the size of a human's footprints, his footprints, and they led all the way to the security office door. He left a note for Ray and took the next night off, hoping a break would help clear his mind. But when he came back, Ray was gone. Nobody knew where he was. He'd left during his shift and never returned. No one had seen or heard from him since. That night, Max had the strangest, most vivid dream. He was standing in Gallery B, but he couldn't move. His limbs felt heavy, his skin cold. He could see Ray standing across from him, staring at him with wide, terrified eyes. Max tried to scream, but no sound came out. He felt trapped, bound to the spot. He woke up in a cold sweat, but the feeling lingered, a heavy sensation in his chest that he couldn't shake. When he returned to the museum the following night, he was hesitant to walk past Gallery B, but something pulled him there, an unexplainable force that made him want to see the statue. It was back on its pedestal, looking as still and silent as ever. But now, standing beside it, was another statue, a man with wide, terrified eyes, his mouth frozen open in a silent scream. The stone face looked eerily familiar. Max stumbled back, his hands trembling as he realized the awful truth. It was Ray. Panicking, he turned and fled down the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the empty museum. But as he passed another gallery, he froze. Reflected in the glass display case was his own face. But it wasn't his face. It was twisted, stone gray, and his eyes were hollow, frozen in an expression of terror. He bolted out of the museum, never stopping to look back. He never returned, never spoke of what he'd seen. The museum tried to contact him, but he ignored every call, knowing he could never set foot in that place again. But every night he dreams of it, the cold, stone feeling creeping over his skin, the weight settling into his limbs, the silent whisper of a voice calling him back to the museum. And sometimes, When he's lying alone in bed, he hears the faint scrape of stone against stone, as if something or someone is moving through the dark halls, searching for him, waiting to bring him back. It was nearly midnight when Samantha's car broke down on an isolated stretch of highway. She'd been on her way back from visiting her family, and after hours of driving through desolate roads, her car sputtered and rolled to a stop. She was in the middle of nowhere with no cell signal and only the dim glow of her headlights illuminating the empty road ahead. She was trying to decide whether to wait or start walking to find help when she noticed something unusual. A flickering light in the distance, deep in the woods on the other side of the road. She squinted, unsure if she was imagining it, but it was definitely there. A faint orange glow, like firelight. It was too cold and too dark to stay in the car all night, so she decided to investigate. Maybe someone nearby could help. She grabbed her flashlight and jacket, locked her car, and made her way into the woods. The further she walked, the quieter everything became. The only sound was the crunch of her footsteps on the forest floor. Eventually, she reached a small clearing, and in the center of it was an old, crumbling cabin. The flickering light was coming from one of its windows. Samantha felt a chill as she approached the cabin. The place looked abandoned, with broken windows, sagging wood, and weeds creeping up the walls. But someone or something was inside. She could see the shadows dancing across the walls, hear the faint crackle of flames. She hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back, but she was desperate. She raised her hand and knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the silent woods. No one answered. She tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. Then she heard a voice from inside, soft and barely audible, like a whisper carried by the wind. "Come in." The voice was strange, raspy and broken, but it sounded inviting, almost kind. Heart pounding. Samantha pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit by a small fire in the fireplace, casting eerie shadows across the walls. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and something else, something metallic and sour. "Hello?" She called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer. She shone her flashlight around the room. Dust covered every surface, and the furniture was old, broken, as if no one had lived there for decades. But then she noticed something strange. On the wall, in the firelight, she could see words scratched into the wood, faint but legible. "Leave while you can." She froze, her breath catching in her throat. She felt an icy prickle on the back of her neck and turned, but there was no one there. She backed up, ready to leave, but as she turned toward the door, she saw someone standing there, a figure cloaked in shadows, their face obscured. They were tall, thin, and utterly motionless, blocking her way out. Are you the owner?" she stammered, taking a step back. The figure didn't respond, only tilted its head slightly, watching her. Samantha's flashlight flickered, casting the room into momentary darkness, and when it came back on, the figure was gone. Heart racing, she stumbled backward, tripping over something on the floor. She glanced down and froze. It was a pile of old, cracked photo frames. She picked one up, wiping away the grime, and her blood went cold. The photo was of a young woman standing in front of the same cabin, smiling. But her eyes looked familiar. They were her own eyes. She dropped the frame, hands shaking, and backed away. She turned to run, but as she reached the door, she heard it again. The whisper, closer this time. "Don't go. We've been waiting for you." The air grew colder, and the room filled with a soft, eerie laughter. She could hear it echoing from every direction, overlapping voices all around her, as if coming from the walls themselves. Samantha bolted for the door, pulling it open with all her strength. But just as she stepped outside, something grabbed her wrist. An icy, bony hand, fingers like claws digging into her skin. She screamed, yanking herself free, and sprinted back toward the road, her flashlight bobbing wildly. As she neared her car, she glanced back. The cabin was dark, its light gone, and there was no sign of anyone or anything. She fumbled for her keys, her hands shaking, and climbed into the car, locking the doors. To her relief, the engine sputtered to life, and she sped away, not daring to look back. It wasn't until she reached the nearest gas station that she felt safe. She stepped out to call for a tow truck, her heart finally starting to slow down. But when she glanced down at her wrist, she froze. There, on her skin, was a faint handprint, dark, bruised, as if something had gripped her tightly. She shivered, her mind racing, but told herself it was just her imagination. She tried to convince herself that the entire experience had been a mix of exhaustion and the tricks of a lonely, dark night. But that night, as she lay in bed, she heard it again. A soft whisper, barely audible, as if someone were standing right beside her. "Don't go, we're still waiting for you." Samantha never returned to that stretch of road, but the whisper followed her. No matter where she went, she would hear it. Every night, growing louder. And sometimes in the reflection of a window or the edge of a mirror, she would catch a glimpse of a shadow, a figure, tall and thin, watching her from just out of sight. It was a quiet night at the hospital, the kind of night that left the nurses and doctors with a lingering feeling of unease. Tom had just started his shift as the overnight security guard, a job he'd been doing for years without anything too unusual happening. But tonight, something felt different. The halls seemed darker, the lights flickered more often, and the air felt thick with something unexplainable. As Tom made his rounds through the mostly empty corridors, he kept thinking he saw someone out of the corner of his eye, a woman in a hospital gown, her dark hair falling over her face. But every time he turned to look, the hallways were empty. He shook it off, thinking it was just the exhaustion getting to him. Around 3 a.m., he reached the abandoned wing of the hospital. This section had been closed off for years, and no one ever went in there. The door was locked, and a thick layer of dust covered the floor. He normally didn't check that wing, but tonight, as he passed by, he noticed something odd. The door was slightly ajar. He stopped, shining his flashlight down the darkened hallway. The door creaked as he nudged it open wider. He knew he should close it and keep walking, but something drew him inside. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was a sense of duty, or maybe it was something he couldn't explain, something pulling him forward. The air in the abandoned wing was stale, heavy with the scent of mold and decay. The walls were peeling, the floors cracked. He took a few steps, shining his flashlight into the shadows, the silence oppressive. He called out, half hoping someone would answer, but his voice echoed unanswered down the empty hall. Just as he was about to turn back, he heard it, a faint, dragging sound like something being pulled across the floor. It was coming from one of the rooms further down the hall. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but his feet kept moving, almost against his will. He reached the room at the end of the hall, the door half closed. The sound stopped as he stepped closer, replaced by an eerie silence. He pushed the door open and shone his light inside. The room was empty except for a single bed, covered with a thin, tattered sheet. But as he moved his flashlight, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Footprints in the dust, leading from the bed to the corner of the room. And in the corner, crouched in the shadows, was the figure of a woman. She was facing the wall, her back to him, her hair long and tangled, her skin pale and sickly. He felt a wave of nausea as he realized she wasn't moving, wasn't breathing. He called out to her softly, his voice barely a whisper. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Slowly, she turned her head, but only her head. Her body remained twisted, still facing the wall, as her face tilted toward him. Her eyes were hollow, dark as pitch, and her mouth was twisted into an unnatural smile, stretched too wide. Tom stumbled back, his heart pounding, but before he could move, she spoke. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice cold and broken. "You weren't supposed to see." He turned and ran, the flashlight shaking in his hand as he sprinted down the hall. Behind him, he heard her laughter, a soft, chilling sound that echoed off the walls, growing louder and louder as he ran. It followed him all the way down the corridor, even as he slammed the door shut behind him. He didn't stop running until he was back at the security office, locking the door and slumping against it, his breath coming in gasps. He glanced at the monitor, half expecting to see her standing there, staring back at him. But instead, he saw something even worse. The security camera feed from the abandoned wing was live, showing the empty halls. But as he watched, something appeared on the screen. The woman was there, standing in the middle of the hallway, her head tilted, looking directly at the camera, as if she could see him watching her. She lifted one hand, pointing down the hall, and mouthed the words, "Come back." The camera feed flickered, her image disappearing, but the words hung in his mind, cold and insistent. He knew he could never go back to that wing, But every night from then on, he could hear her voice whispering to him from the darkened corners of the hospital, "Come back." As the days went by, the sightings grew more frequent. He would catch glimpses of her reflection in windows, hear the faint drag of her feet down the hall when he was alone, and each time she grew closer, her hollow eyes fixed on him, her smile widening. One night, a fellow guard found him sitting alone in the security office, his eyes wide and vacant, muttering the same words over and over. She's waiting for me. She won't stop. She wants me to come back." No one ever saw him again after that night. But every once in a while, on the monitors in the empty wing, a dark, shadowed figure can be seen moving down the hall, a figure with wide, empty eyes, a twisted smile, and a message for anyone who dares to look: "Come back." Sarah had never been one to believe in the paranormal. She was a rational, no-nonsense type who laughed off ghost stories and insisted on scientific explanations for strange events. So, when she inherited her grandmother's old house in the country, she thought nothing of moving in alone. The house was beautiful, but eerily quiet, with antique furniture and creaky wooden floors. It had been in the family for generations, and as a child, Sarah had loved exploring it. But her grandmother had warned her to stay away from the basement, saying only that it was a place for the past. On her second night in the house, Sarah started hearing the scratching. It was faint at first, like something brushing against the walls, coming from somewhere below. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was probably just mice or the house settling. But the next night, the scratching grew louder. It seemed to be coming from under her bed. And when she looked, nothing was there. Then it moved, shifting to the walls, always somewhere just out of reach, as though it was following her movements through the house. By the third night, Sarah was starting to lose sleep. The scratching had become relentless, and there was a soft whispering too, barely audible, as if someone were muttering under their breath, but she couldn't quite make out the words. She checked the attic, the walls, every corner she could think of, but nothing was there. Finally, as the scratching grew louder, she decided she had no choice but to investigate the basement. She found the old iron key in her grandmother's jewelry box and headed downstairs, her flashlight casting long, narrow beams through the dusty air. The basement door groaned as it swung open, revealing steep, narrow steps that led down into darkness. The air was thick and musty, and the smell of damp earth filled her nostrils as she descended. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a small, cramped room lined with shelves filled with jars and dusty boxes. Her flashlight swept across the shelves, landing on a large, wooden chest in the corner, covered in cobwebs. The scratching sound stopped as she approached the chest. She hesitated, her heart pounding, and reached out to open it. Inside, she found a collection of old photographs and letters, all wrapped in yellowed paper. There was a thick leather-bound journal at the bottom, marked with her grandmother's initials. As she flipped through the journal, she began to realize what her grandmother had kept hidden. The family's secrets, stories of strange occurrences and disappearances that had plagued the house for decades. Each entry grew darker, more frantic, describing an unseen presence that lurked in the basement, something her grandmother had tried to seal away. "It wants a new host," one entry read, scrawled in shaky handwriting. "It waits for someone to find it." She snapped the journal shut, feeling a chill run down her spine. That's when she heard it again, the scratching, louder this time, right behind her. She turned slowly, her flashlight beam landing on the wall directly opposite her. Etched into the brick were deep, dark scratch marks, as if something had clawed its way through stone. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw that the scratches were fresh. She stumbled back, but as she turned to run, she felt a cold hand on her shoulder, its grip tightening. The room filled with a low, guttural whisper, like a voice from the depths of the earth, and for the first time she understood the words. "Stay with me." Her flashlight flickered, the room plunging into darkness. She felt the cold hand pull her backward, dragging her deeper into the basement. She tried to scream, but her voice was lost, swallowed by the shadows. The darkness seemed to press in around her, suffocating her, the scratching and whispering filling her ears, growing louder and louder until it was all she could hear. Hours later, when dawn broke, a neighbor noticed the front door of the house standing open. They called the police, who searched the house but found no trace of Sarah. Her belongings were left untouched, her car parked outside, but there was no sign of where she had gone. The only clue was the basement door, still slightly ajar, and the faint sound of scratching coming from somewhere deep within the walls. They assumed it was rats or mice, but none of them dared to check. One officer swore he heard a voice, faint and desperate, whispering from the darkness. "Stay with me." Evan had been a paramedic for years, and he'd seen his share of horrors. Accidents, crime scenes, illnesses that were merciless and fast. But there was one call he could never forget, one that still haunted him every night. It was a stormy night. Sheets of rain pounding the ambulance as he and his partner, Sarah, responded to a call from an old remote house on the outskirts of town. The dispatcher hadn't had many details, just that an elderly woman had called in, her voice faint, saying she needed help. The call had cut off abruptly, and no one had been able to reach her since. As they pulled up to the house, Evan felt a chill. The house was old and crumbling, its windows dark, and the front yard was overgrown with weeds. The storm had knocked out the streetlights, and the only illumination came from their headlights, casting long, eerie shadows across the lawn. They knocked on the door, calling out, but there was no answer. After a moment, they pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was thick and stale, filled with a strange metallic smell, like rust and something else Evan couldn't place. They searched the ground floor but found nothing except dust-covered furniture and walls lined with faded photographs. Finally, they heard a faint, wheezing sound coming from upstairs. "Hello?" Sarah called out as they climbed the creaky staircase. The sound stopped, replaced by silence. They reached the top of the stairs and found themselves in a narrow hallway lined with closed doors. As they walked down the hall, the wheezing sound began again, louder this time, coming from the room at the end of the hall. They approached, and Evan pushed the door open. Inside was a small, dimly lit bedroom. A frail, elderly woman lay on a bed in the center of the room, her eyes closed, her skin pale and almost translucent. She looked so still, so lifeless, that for a moment, Evan thought they were too late. But then her eyes snapped open, wide and terrified, as she looked straight at him. "Please, don't let him take me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Evan and Sarah exchanged a confused look. "Ma'am, it's okay. We're here to help," Sarah said, approaching her slowly. But the woman shook her head, gripping the edge of the bed with bony fingers. "He's here," she gasped, her eyes darting to the corner of the room. Evan followed her gaze, his flashlight illuminating the shadowed corner. At first, he saw nothing, just the empty wall. But as his eyes adjusted, he noticed something. A figure standing just barely within the shadows, tall and impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and twisted, almost inhuman. The figure seemed to shift, the shadows deepening around it as it watched them, unmoving. Its face was obscured, but Evan could feel its eyes on him, cold and unblinking. Sarah gasped, backing away, her hand reaching for the woman's, trying to pull her from the bed. But the woman was frozen, her gaze locked on the shadowy figure, tears streaming down her face. "He's been watching me, waiting for so long," she whispered, her voice shaking. "He never leaves." Evan felt an overwhelming urge to run, to get out of that house as fast as he could. But he forced himself to stay, trying to remain calm. "Ma'am, we need to get you out of here," he said, moving to help Sarah lift her. But as they reached for her, the figure in the corner began to move. Slowly, its body bending in unnatural angles as it slithered closer. Evan could feel a freezing chill radiating from it, the air growing so cold that he could see his breath. The woman began to sob, clutching Evan's arm, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so frail. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "He's already inside." And then her face changed. Her eyes, once filled with fear, turned dark and hollow, her mouth twisting into an unnatural smile. She let go of his arm and began to laugh, a low guttural sound that filled the room, sending chills down Evan's spine. Evan and Sarah stumbled back, horrified. The woman's body began to twitch, her limbs contorting, her eyes fixed on them, unblinking. The shadowy figure stood behind her now, its twisted arms reaching down, resting on her shoulders as if guiding her movements. "We were waiting for you," she whispered, her voice now a deep, echoing rasp that was nothing like the voice they had heard before. "You didn't come in time." Evan's heart raced as he grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her out of the room. They ran down the hallway, the woman's laughter echoing behind them, growing louder, more distorted with each step. They barely made it out of the house, slamming the door shut behind them. Rain poured down as they reached the ambulance, both of them gasping for breath, drenched and shaking. As they sped away, neither of them spoke. They knew what they had seen, and no amount of rational explanation could erase it. Later that night, back at the station, Evan looked up the address. But there was no record of the house, no recent calls from an elderly woman in that area. The dispatcher insisted no such call had come in, that they must have gone to the wrong address. Evan didn't sleep that night, and neither did Sarah. The next morning, they drove back to the location, determined to make sense of what they'd seen. But when they arrived, the house was gone. Only an empty, muddy field remained, untouched and overgrown, as though no building had stood there for decades. They searched the area, hoping for any clue, but there was nothing. As they walked back to the ambulance, Sarah pointed to something half buried in the mud. Evan knelt down and brushed the dirt away, was now revealing an old, tarnished locket. He opened it, and inside was a faded photograph of a young woman, the same woman they had seen in the bed, her eyes bright and full of life, her smile gentle and warm. But in the background of the photo, barely visible, was the same twisted, shadowy figure, watching her from the darkness. Megan had been a night shift cleaner for years, accustomed to eerie silences and empty hallways in the buildings she worked. She was assigned to the old city library one winter, a massive stone structure with towering ceilings and dark, dusty aisles. People said it was haunted, but Megan had laughed it off. She was used to empty buildings, creaks, and drafts. One night, Megan was working alone on the top floor. She was dusting shelves when she noticed a faint flicker of light at the end of an aisle. She thought maybe someone had left a lamp on, or that her eyes were playing tricks on her. She walked over, and as she got closer, she saw a small flame dancing, barely illuminating a single book lying open on the floor. There was no sign of anyone nearby. She picked up the book, feeling a chill as she turned it over. It was a dusty, old tome. The cover faded, and the pages yellowed. The title was in a language she didn't recognize, the letters twisted and jagged. She started to close it, but something on the page caught her eye, an old black and white photograph. It showed a girl in a long, dark dress, standing in front of the very aisle Megan was in. But the strangest part was that the girl looked almost exactly like her. Same height, same build, same long, dark hair. Confused and a bit unsettled, Megan closed the book and placed it back on the shelf. But as she turned to walk away, she heard it. A soft, eerie humming coming from behind her. She froze, her heart pounding. Slowly, she turned back, shining her flashlight down the aisle. There was no one there, just the rows of books and the eerie quiet of the library. Then she noticed something strange. The book she had just put away was back on the floor, open to the same page. The girl's photograph was gone, replaced by a faint shadow, almost like a fingerprint smeared across the page. Her instincts told her to leave, to run, and not look back. But Megan felt compelled to examine the book again, as if something was pulling her toward it. She reached down, and just as her fingers brushed the cover, she felt a cold, bony hand clamp down on her shoulder. She screamed and spun around, but no one was there. The library was empty, silent, except for the faint rustle of pages turning somewhere nearby, as if someone, or something, was reading in the darkness. Her heart racing, she backed away, nearly tripping over her cleaning cart. The humming began again, closer this time, as though it was right behind her. She turned to run, but felt another hand on her shoulder, stronger this time, holding her in place. Her flashlight flickered, casting shadows across the walls, and she caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of her eye. A tall, thin figure with hollow eyes and a twisted smile, its mouth moving as it hummed the strange, eerie tune. It was dressed in a dark, tattered cloak, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones, as though it hadn't seen light in centuries. The figure leaned in close, its mouth next to her ear. "You shouldn't have touched the book," it whispered, its voice low and gravelly, sending chills down her spine. "Now you belong to the library, just like the others." Megan broke free, stumbling backward and nearly dropping her flashlight. She sprinted down the aisle, not daring to look back, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. She reached the stairs and ran down, her breaths coming in shallow gasps as she made her way to the main floor. But as she reached the front doors, she realized they wouldn't budge. No matter how hard she pulled, they were locked tight, as if they hadn't been opened in years. She pounded on the glass, screaming for help, but her voice was swallowed by the silence. Behind her, she heard the soft sound of pages turning again, and that same eerie humming filled the room. She turned, and there it was, the figure standing in the center of the library, its head tilted, watching her with empty, hollow eyes. "Stay with us," it whispered, stretching out one long, bony finger. "Read with us forever." Megan backed away, her hands shaking. She tried to calm herself, tried to tell herself it wasn't real. But then she felt the air shift, cold and suffocating, as though the walls were closing in around her. One by one, the lights in the library went out, plunging her into darkness. She could feel the figure's presence, hear the rustling of pages all around her, the humming growing louder, filling her head, drowning out her thoughts. In a final moment of desperation, she turned on her flashlight, shining it around the room. But instead of finding the exit, she found herself back at the top floor, staring at the same aisle, the same shelf, and the same open book lying on the floor, waiting for her. The last thing Megan remembered was the sound of that haunting melody, wrapping around her like a shroud, pulling her down into darkness as the shadows closed in. The next morning, the library staff found her cleaning cart and flashlight near the front doors, but Megan was nowhere to be seen. They searched every floor, every aisle, but it was as if she had vanished without a trace. Weeks later, a patron browsing the shelves stumbled upon an old book lying open on the floor. Curiosity got the better of them, and they flipped through the pages, stopping when they found an old photograph. It was Megan, her eyes wide and haunted, trapped forever within the pages, her mouth open in a silent scream. And from somewhere deep in the library, a soft, eerie humming began to echo through the empty halls, growing louder with each turn of the page.